In this tutorial, you'll learn information perhaps more pertinent to brand new users to Dreamweaver. So before we get started with any more detail about where things are and how they work within Dreamweaver, I initially want to explain the different types of websites you might possibly want to create. So, as I allude, the information in this tutorial is more applicable to new users, because new users perhaps have never even considered the complexities and related ramifications of building particular types of site. And when I mention types of site, I'm referring to making the decision to build what are known as either static or dynamic sites. Essentially, there are two kinds of websites you can create with Dreamweaver. The first, or at least easier, and therefore more popular type of site is known as a static site, where you build every page on your computer, adding in all the text, images, videos, sounds, links, etc., prior to uploading all that to the server that you have chosen. The server, by the way, is more than likely going to be on a shared area on a hosting website. For the vast majority of static sites, this will be sufficient, but do be aware that if your site becomes very popular, you might want to switch away from a shared hosting package because the traffic your site generates will possibly mean the site loads more slowly, and this is compounded by the fact that if other unrelated websites run on the same shared hosting server, then the speed at which users can see your site will fluctuate dependent on the amount of traffic viewing the sites on the shared hosting server. By contrast to a static site is what's known as a dynamic site, and a dynamic site is one in which all the bare-bone pages that you initially create are subsequently populated by information drawn from a database. Again, you will have to generate the content for the database, but then once that information populates the database, users will see distinct content within your barebone page dependent on the information or content drawn from the database. Maybe a very obvious example of this sort of site is a news website. The BBC News website over here in the UK, for example, contains a considerable amount of content that is constantly being updated. And not only that, content that does get updated is often specific to certain areas within the country. So if I'm using the BBC News website in London, then I'll see relevant content for the London area, rather than displayed content from a different area within the UK. Another example of a dynamic site would be a sports website, whereby every team in the league has its own distinct data that gets called into the framework or bare-bone shell page that does contain a little static content, such as the website name's banner and various tables, but as a sports fan uses the website, he or she will see only pertinent content for the team searched for, rather than on an opposing team. That doesn't mean that he or she can't search for other teams. They can. It's just that the content that is displayed is shown by the initial team search term. Now at this point you might be asking, why not just make all sites dynamic sites? Well, to help answer that, I'll talk through some of the advantages and disadvantages of static and dynamic sites. I think the main advantage of having a website comprised of static web pages is that they are comparatively easy to learn, and you'll require no programming skills to create this type of site. Other advantages include you have total control over the look and featured content of each page. Additionally, perhaps an often overlooked advantage too is static sites are very easy to test and publish to your designated web server. And consequently, there are very few specific hosting requirements necessary. In fact, static sites are very popular with hosting companies because of the relatively easy maintenance for the hosting company. Okay, so those are some of the advantages, but like everything in life, there will be some disadvantages too. And some of the disadvantages are as follows. Perhaps the main disadvantage of creating static web pages is that personalization or interactivity that you create with the site has to run in what is known as client-side, i.e. in the browser. Although, on the whole, for most starter sites, to be fair, this isn't too problematic because the sites won't necessarily contain much content that needs to be copied with maybe slight adjustments over many similar pages. To go back to the sports site I mentioned a moment ago, that dynamic type of site requires different content to be loaded within a certain part of a web page when a user searches for a specific team. However, with a static family tree site, for example, then the content can be static in that for specific pages, the content will always be the same no matter what the user is searching for. For example, the content on the page about Uncle George will always display the same no matter who looks at it. More's the pity with Uncle George. Now, updating a static site like this can become increasingly disadvantageous though when the site contains lots of pages for many family members, in that updating multiple pages soon becomes cumbersome without the implementation of automated widgets or extensions. Thankfully, there are a number of options in the form of Dreamweaver extensions that do help alleviate the problem though. Now, we will look at integrating extensions into Dreamweaver in a later tutorial. So, those are some of the pros and cons of static sites. Let's look at some advantages of dynamic sites. I think perhaps the main advantage of a dynamic site is that no matter how large the site becomes, it won't require a lot of HTML files on the hosting server. By contrast to static sites, dynamic sites tend to implement template pages much more and are populated by data fed to it based on the content within the site's database that is sent from the web browser. With large sites, using content drawn and fed from a database can save significant time and server space. You can see, therefore, that dynamic website content is stored in a database as opposed to being coded into static pages, and as a consequence, this allows content updates to be virtually immediate and only dependent on the user's search term. In previous years, some disadvantages of dynamic sites included the cost of hosting a site like this was higher. However, in today's economic climate, hosting companies are lowering prices universally to capture as much business as possible. Therefore, that disadvantage is receding. Right then, so that's some information about the difference between static and dynamic sites.